Welcome to the Jay-Z Show. I am Zafar Subhan from Dhaka, Bangladesh. I'm joined by John Danilowitz, my partner in crime from outside Boston, I presume. Though, of course, John is such an international man of mystery. We're never quite sure where he is at any time or any day. And we are joined today especially by uh, Jyoti Rahman, executive editor of Counterpoint, who is going to be talking to us about the latest what's going on in Bangladeshi politics. What have we been talking about for the last week? We have been talking about the removal or the resignation of the Bangladesh bank governor. Of course, the US Bangladesh trade deal is also in the frame. But before we talk about any of this, let's take a second, because we live right now in extremely fraught historic times. Um, there's a hot war going on right now in terms of the bombing of Iran. And then, of course, Iran has had retaliatory strikes all over the Middle East. And this is a really fraught situation right now. So I think it behooves us to start by talking about that a little, perhaps with an eye on what does that actually mean for Bangladesh. So, John, why don't you start us off?
Sure, thanks. Well, I remember vividly where I was when U.S. started operations in the Middle East in both the first Gulf War and the second Gulf War, and in both cases there was a fairly developed lead up to those combat operations. By contrast, even though there had been lots of discussion about the negotiations with Iran, a U.S. military buildup, the possibility of military actions. Still, this came to me as a surprise when President Trump, showed up before the camera wearing his trademark baseball hat and spoke for a few minutes about the beginning of major combat operations. Yet, with for the first time, I think in recent history, no real congressional authorization,
Sure.
no authorization for the use of force. So there's a lot of questions in the United States, even in terms of what to expect in terms of duration. And then, of course, the shocking news that the supreme leader of Iran had been killed in the first phase of combat
That's right. Now
operations.
confirmed even by Iranian media. So I think
Now,
that's absolutely correct. Yeah.
now confirmed. Now, several commentators I saw online said there probably wasn't a coincidence that these operations took place on a Friday, while in the U.S. and other places the markets were closed. So we'll wait to see how that falls out. But you're right. I mean, this injects a note of uncertainty in the United States, certainly in the Middle East, but for Bangladesh as well. And I think particularly in the context of a new government, finding its footing, trying to embark upon a very ambitious governing plan, but now having something else that we'll have to deal with beyond some of the other issues that have cropped up, including, as you mentioned, the U.S. trade agreement, and then some of the personnel moves. So, yeah, Jyoti, I'm hoping you and Zafar can help me make sense of all of this, because my brick wall behind me is, damaged in a couple places from me banging my head up against it in recent days, trying to kind of figure out what's going on.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things which you said I wanted to pick up on, and I'll just bring Jyoti in right afterwards, is that I think what this war, essentially, what we're seeing, really underlines is that there's an entirely new um, order in terms of how America operates in the world, and therefore, as America is the preeminent power in today's world, and how the world operates. And I think we really need to understand this. The rules of the game, as they have existed, probably since roughly since the end of the Second World War, have all been really thrown out of the window. And I think again, we need to understand that this is a very new world we live in, with the United States under Trump's leadership during his presidency. Now, this may not last beyond 2028. We don't know. We don't know what the future holds. But right now, that's 2028 is the distant future. Frankly, we need to talk about the here and now. And I think the message or the lesson here is that really understandings of the world that existed a year, 2, 3 years ago no longer hold sway. And we need to understand that when we figure out what is Bangladesh's place in this world and how should Bangladesh address various issues in terms of navigating this new global environment. But Jyoti, why don't you, we'll use that as a segue.
Right. So, okay. So, what's the question? What do you
Okay, no,
want me
okay.
to
Well, like I said, that was
ask?
more of a comment, right? The question, the reason you're here is that let's move on very briefly because, of course, the big
Sure.
sorry, the big thing everyone's talking about right now.
Or maybe I could just comment on your comment.
Okay,
Is
you
that
could, and then
right?
I'll come back to you again, and we'll
Sure.
talk about your area of specific expertise. But please do, yeah.
Okay. Sure. Okay. So one thing, sort of maybe I could comment on your comment and John's
Yes,
comment
go ahead.
is that if we take that premise as given, and that the way U.S. as the global hegemon is operating right now in 2026, who knows what would happen after the midterm or after 2028? But right now, at least up until November, the way the US is operating is fundamentally different from anything that we had been used to. If we take that as a given, then that also means that we should recalibrate the way we operate in Bangladesh. And what that means is that we should not take the US Bangladesh trade agreement that was signed up by the interim government the way we would have if it was done with a different administration. Specifically, for example, the trade agreement has many clauses that normally so there are two issues with the trade agreement. One is, should an interim administration have signed it? And you could argue that no, an interim administration or a caretaker administration should never really do such thing. But then you could argue that, okay, this was not a caretaker administration, this was an interim government, post-revolution, etc., etc. You can have an also, sort of completely sort of domestic Bangladeshi politics discussion around that. But specifically with respect to the US, there is a thing which is that, okay, there are things in there that with any other American administration, if this kind of agreement was done, we would object to it. What are we talking about? There are clauses that basically says that if there are Bangladeshi state-owned enterprises, say, for example, a jute mill or a sugar mill in Kumilla or Rangpur is engaging with the Chinese, then US has a right to sanction Bangladesh. I'm putting it very simply and bluntly, without getting into the the legal language, which is not my field. So I'm just simplifying it grossly. But that's how that's how it reads to a layperson, right? And obviously that's problematic. The thing is that the Trump administration is not like any previous administration, and the Trump Washington is not like how previous one. It's not normal times in Washington. So in Washington of 2026, reading sort of those lines line by line and panicking about it is probably not going to be helpful, because nobody in Washington is going to sit and say that, okay, the Sonar Bangla jute mill in Rangpur is engaging with the Chinese, we have to sanction Bangladesh, or see if this is actually being done. That's just not how the world is operating at the moment. And therefore, let's just hold our breath. This is what was needed to get the Trump administration off our back, or get Bangladesh off Trump's radar. And now that that's done, let's just keep our head down. Hopefully he doesn't notice us, leaves us alone. And once we are beyond November or beyond 2028, we can come back and see what the world looks like. So that would be how I would comment on your observation, or observe on your observation.
Yeah, if I could just jump in.
John, yeah, please.
Yeah, let me just jump in on that. So I think the first question that Bangladesh needs to ask itself, and the new government needs to ask itself, is there value in having a good relationship with the United States? And there's lots of factors that would go into that. But if the answer is yes, then I think from Bangladesh's perspective, they have to think about what matters to the United States about Bangladesh. And, helpfully, President Trump clarified this in the letter that he sent to Prime Minister Tariq Rahman, congratulating him on his election. And the first thing that Trump led with was the new trade agreement. And then he talked about, other issues, including, the security relationship, et cetera. So I think what's getting lost in the discussion of the nitty gritty of the trade deal is the broader relationship. And my fear is that with the interim government having done what it did, and again, I think for defensible and admirable reasons, if the new government in Bangladesh were to be seen as walking away from that, then to the point both of you made earlier in terms of how the U.S. and the Trump administration acts differently, my fear would be that this would not only sink U.S.-Bangladesh relations, but there would be some real serious blowback. I mean, even, for example, in something like the humanitarian assistance realm, already earlier this year, the United States was cutting back its assistance to Rohingya refugees. I think because of the goodwill that the interim government generated with the good faith efforts on the trade deal, the U.S. came forward with another, I think, $60 million to help feed the Rohingya refugees. I'm not sure going forward in a future in which the U.S.-Bangladesh relationship is not in a good place, whether the Trump administration would be inclined to continue that kind of support. And there's other areas as well. So again, this isn't a threat. This is just a reflection of reality. So there's I think a fundamental shift that's taken place, which I think you both have looked at. And whereas in the past, the relationship between the U.S. might have appeared to have been more altruistic on the part of the United States, that the United States was looking for ways to help Bangladesh, whether it was in development or with trade policy or security, et cetera. I think those days are over, and it's very much a transactional relationship now. And in that regard, frankly, I don't see that Bangladesh has a heck of a lot of leverage with the United States.
And that's just the way it is. And I think there are two things I would add. One is, Bangladesh is not unique in this. I mean, I think every country around the world, by and large, to a greater or lesser extent, is finding this out. The second is, and this gets to the point Jyoti was making about the nitty-gritty of the trade deal. I think one of the things which is the hallmarks of President Trump's foreign policy is the nitty-gritty doesn't matter so much, is the overall vibe. And it's kind of important to be, in terms of how he feels it. And so I think right now we're in a good place as far as that goes. For whatever reason, he seems as though, to the extent that Bangladesh is on his radar, we have played our cards pretty well, pretty right. And there are a number of reasons for that. I think I would give the credit to the interim government for how they've navigated this situation in the last 18 months. And I think that is much more important actually than the nitty-gritty, the minutiae of what may or may not be in an agreement. And I think people looking to argue or negotiate or lawyer the fine points of this agreement and that agreement, it's a fundamental misunderstanding of how business is going to be conducted moving forward. And and I get it, because it's a normal misunderstanding to make, because from time immemorial, this is how people looking at foreign policy and agreements have looked at them. But I think this is very different, and we need to understand this. And I guess it's circling back to our original point. What's going on in the world in Iran shows us very much how this is an entirely new world, and many of the norms and many of the rules and many of the ways of doing business are just no longer extant. But I wanted to move to from sort of global vision to a sort of a more narrow Bangladeshi vision. The big talk in Bangladesh, of course, over the last few days has been the resignation of our Bangladesh Bank governor, Ehsan Manzoor, and there's been a fairly controversial appointment in his place. Jyoti is a resident expert on such matters. Why don't you give us your 2 cents worth?
Thanks. Right. So while the global politics and geopolitics and geostrategic stuff and old rules don't apply and all of those things, everything we've just heard, sadly, when it comes to economic matters, I would argue that those very old rules apply more so than ever, right? Old rules like you cannot really spend money that you don't have, right? Particularly if you are a low middle income country like Bangladesh. If you are a newly elected government with a massive mandate and promises that that you have made to people, that you need to keep, that you are facing, you have come in facing price pressures, and historically keeping the prices down had been, or historically failing to keep prices down have undone politicians and governments going back, sort of 50, 60, 70 years, right? So those rules still apply more than ever. So that's the point number one that I would make. Okay. So with that in mind, so what happened is this. Hassan Mansour came in as the governor of Bangladesh Bank when Hasina fled. With Hasina, her governor, as in Bangladesh Bank governor at that time, was Rauf Talukdar. And he fled along with Hasina, or just after Hasina, in August 2024. Okay, so Hassan Mansour was appointed in August 2024. So at that time, or before then, so Rauf Talukdar, under Rauf Talukdar, Bangladesh Bank, or Bangladesh, the stock of reserve, foreign exchange reserve, was halved, right? So it went from something over $40 billion to something below 20 billion over 18 months, 20 months, couple of years, something like that. Taka went from something like 80, 85 taka against US dollar to something like 120, 125, depending on, and this is informal market. In informal market, it went to 135, 140, something like that. We used to, at that time, sort of in WhatsApp threads and all of that, the talks were that, okay, where would this end? Okay. In 2023, at the beginning of 2023, I had a bet that whether at the beginning of 2023, the formal exchange rate was still below 100, and I had a bet that it would be over 135, and it was informally it was over 135 by the end of 2023. So that was the kind of that was the kind of thing that we're talking about. Okay, in 2024 when Hassan Mansour came in, under him, taka was stable, and reserves actually started building up. Okay, so by the time elections happened, reserves were over 30 billion. Okay, 30.1, 30.2, 30.6, whatever. Definitely over 30. Zafar, you would remember that one of our Counterpoint annual prediction challenge 2026, one of the questions was whether taka would be ending the year higher or lower than it began, right? So taka had been stable since, broadly stable since August 2026. August 2024. If anything, if taka was a fully floating currency, if there wasn't any intervention at all, then taka probably would have appreciated against US dollar. Okay, so at least on that metric, that's what had happened. Banking sector was a mess, complete mess, and we all know the story that the under Hasina regime, cronies took the money, they borrowed and then they siphoned. So sort of a plunder and launder scheme, right? So we all know all of those things. So I'm not gonna get into the details. I would not say that banking sector was cleaned up. That would be going way too far, but at least the bleeding was stopped. Okay, so what happened? That's the question, right? Okay, this is where things get murky. There were a lot of dissension within the bank. Okay, so on the one hand, it is absolutely true that Hassan Mansour stabilized the macroeconomy. That's absolutely true. Or the other thing that I mentioned, how did he do this? He did this by raising interest rate to stabilize the currency, and he was really tough on banks. Okay, he took really tough corrective measures, disciplinary measures with the banks. Right. Again, without getting into the nitty-gritty, but sort of just suffice it to say that he got the banks to disclose a lot of their books, non-performing loans. And he was tough on the bad banks, the 5 really underperforming banks. The idea is that they'd be merged together to form one bank, and that bank would be capitalized with taxpayer money, and also bring in other investors, so that you could, you could keep that separate. You could keep that bank from keeping, you would isolate it from contaminating everybody else. So that's the idea, right? Okay, so these were good things that he did, and he's absolutely to be lauded for that. But internally in the bank, we have to admit that we have to appreciate, or we have to understand, that he was an external person. Institutions like Bangladesh Bank, or internal bureaucracies in Bangladesh or countries like Bangladesh, there is a deep-seated bureaucratic culture, and external people are not always liked. In fact, they are usually distrusted or disliked. And if you are an external person brought in as the boss, then you have to work really hard to earn people's trust. Now, it is not always impossible. It is possible. Fakhruddin Ahmed, who eventually became controversial for different reasons, for becoming chief advisor to 111 regime, that is a different thing altogether. But he was very much liked as the governor of the Bangladesh Bank. He was an external person. He came from the World Bank, but he was very much liked. Okay, Fakhruddin Ahmed was a very different personality. Ehsan Mansour probably was not as well liked as Fakhruddin Ahmed. There were, feathers were ruffled and all of those kind of things. So there were internal problems. Okay, so that is also true. Okay, some of those internal problems were used probably to instigate, and there are always people in Bangladesh anywhere to, instigate, foment trouble, so it would make a fascinating. So we in Counterpoint are not, at least not yet, Zafar, into investigative reporting. But if there are people who are out there, they could, this could make a very interesting story. So
the backstory of what happened between Ehsan Mansour and the other staff at the Bangladesh Bank. I do think there is a story there. Yes.
Yeah, but when that did happen. And so, sort of that happened. Ehsan Mansour left. And then, and the government, in its infinite wisdom, which I say in pure sarcasm, decided to appoint somebody who, without absolutely, let me stress it, without meaning it in any way about the individual's persona. So without meaning it in about any, about the governor designates or the new governor's personal capacity, just pointing it out, that was a extremely unorthodox choice, because the challenges that we face are all orthodox challenges. Okay, we still face high oil prices because of the things that we talked about, Middle East. We still face high inflation. In fact, prices are continuing, they continue to challenge. They will continue to challenge. Government still has a deficit, and government they still have to pay for all the promises that they have made, and that they have a budget coming up within a few months, and they'll have to finance those things. And those financing would probably be more difficult given the choices, given the appointment, because this is not a orthodox appointment. They would have to explain the rationale for what happened and so on, which is not going to be easy. The business lobby always asks for low interest rate, because that's in their benefit, right? But low interest rate when your inflation is high is not necessarily a good thing, right? So business lobby asking for low interest rate, government asking for borrowing. The governor is previously he was a garments owner. He is a garments owner and is intimately tied with the exports lobby, and they always ask for weaker currency, depreciated taka, and that's good for them, but that's bad for
it's not necessarily it's not necessarily so great for the rest of us.
Exactly.
Well, if I could,
so,
if I could
John,
jump in,
if you wanted to,
just a couple questions, because as I'm listening to Jyoti kind of lay this out, first thing comes to mind is if it's not broke, why fix it? And then in terms of the timing of this, in 6 weeks, the bank governor and the finance minister are going to have to face the world, as it were, in Washington at the IMF World Bank spring meetings. The previous governor had 2+ years remaining on his contract, was highly respected in Washington, certainly had those relationships with the bank and the fund and his counterparts. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in Washington. And then I guess, the question of all this is, who's calling the shots? I mean, was this the prime minister's decision? Was this something made by the finance minister? Was it something that just happened? Again, the authorship of something, and all of this gets to the question of, how the government functions, and what, if anything, they will learn from the strong reaction, including from friends, those who have been very supportive of this government and the BNP during the election campaign have been among some of the most vocal critics of this. So, how did it happen, and what is learned from this, if anything?
Absolutely, John. It is. You are right. First, why broke something? Why fix something that's not broken? Right. Absolutely. And also that with the removal of the governor, or with the replacement of the governor, Mansour, with the current governor, basically now it's now the BNP's economy. Okay. So there is no, politically, so that's that purely, right? And now I'm not going to get into the political commentary. So I'll leave that to you guys. You are the experts on that. So all I'll just say on that is that it is now the BNP's economy. Coming back to the economy, just purely on the economic turf, yes, they would have to explain to the world. In Washington, so in the spring meetings, they would have to explain to the IMF and the World Bank and the other the other international partners why this was necessary, and convince them that they don't expect that, how they're not going to be inflationary, because all the signs suggest that there will be, right? So if I didn't know anything about Bangladesh, and I came to Bangladesh and I read about this on the news, or I read about I followed exactly what I was just told. I saw this podcast. As a professional, my gut instinct would be, okay, this country is going to have higher inflation 6 months down the track, right? That would be the professional instinct, right? On top of this, the other thing that I would just point out is that in addition to what's happening in the Gulf and what just happened in Bangladesh in the last week, the thing to look out for would be remittances. Okay, because if you think that there will be pressure on taka to be weaker 6 months, sometime down the track, okay, because interest rates are going to be lower, but also because Garments Lobby would like it to be a weaker taka, right? So if you think that that's going to be the case, if you think that taka is going to be 135, 140 something, 6 months, 12 months, somewhere down the track, right? On the one hand. On the other hand, if you think that the restrictions on the banks, right, that Ehsan Mansour maintained, are going to be relaxed at some point in future, because the discipline is not going to be there for political reasons or otherwise. Again, 6 months, 12 months down the track. And therefore, there will be leakages from the system. There would be, sort of maybe not the industrial scale, army scale, plunder and blunder, maybe not that, but still some form of leakages and some form of siphoning. Okay, so if you expect that there will be, those things, weaker taka and some kind of, pilfering down the way, then it also means that expectation is probably going to, set off a self-fulfilling cycle. And if that happens, what that means is basically that, okay, if you expect taka to be weaker tomorrow, then there is incentive for, informal market to create a black market today and offer a higher rate today, right? So the formal rate might be 122, but I could give you that, maybe tomorrow it could be 130. So maybe why not I give you 125 today, and you can buy for 125 and sell for 128 tomorrow, and you can see where I'm going with this, right? And once that kind of dynamic starts setting in, then for people remitting money from overseas, all of a sudden, the informal channel becomes the hundi channel, the hawala channel. Those things become more profitable. And once you get there, you end up, it doesn't take long before formal remittance channel is hit, and you end up with the kind of balance of payments problems that we had under the later years of Hasina regime. And that is a scary proposition, right? So that is something so with the two Eids coming up, remittances are the thing to look out for.
Interesting. Now, I mean, there's so much more to sort of discuss on this in terms of points both of you raised. One, we still don't know who made this decision. Two, we don't know why the decision was made. Three, we don't understand the timing of the decision. Four, if Ehsan Manzoor, if the thinking was that they wanted someone who's going to lower interest rates, and perhaps Ehsan Manzoor wasn't the person for that, why this particular gentleman? All of these questions, and I think it all rolls down into one sort of big question, is that the BNP really needs to, they were doing very well in their first week after the election, and saying all the right things, and I think they had a good election campaign as well. I think they need to signal that they are different from the party which ran the country from 2001 to 2006, different from the Awami League, which was in power for 15 years. And one of the ways they need to signal that they're different is in these kinds of things. You need transparency, you need communication. And I think that is the real issue. I still think there's enough time to turn this into a victory. If they show that they're listening, and people make mistakes, all governments make decisions all the time. If you make decisions all the time, you may make suboptimal decisions. How you deal with that.
So on that, Zafar, if I could cut in, if I could mention.
Yeah, sure.
So for example, it could be, it just could be, I'm hypothesizing here. It could be, I mentioned that Bangladesh Bank has cultural problems, inefficiency problems, all sorts of sort of internal issues that Mansoor Sahab could not really tackle because of temperament and personality issues. So it could be that as a corporate executive, the current governor could actually be better at addressing those kind of things.
Sure. Right? I mean,
that very much be possible.
Is what John alluded to. I mean, and here's the thing. For all we know, this gentleman could turn out to be a very good Bangladesh Bank governor. His credentials seem unorthodox, but that's not to say he cannot do the job. Maybe he can. I don't want to prejudge the situation.
And on the credential point, the other thing about the credential point is that where those things are lacking, and we both wrote about it, Zafar, those things could also be addressed through mechanisms such as formalized committees, right?
Sure,
So
sure.
he
No,
could,
absolutely.
yeah,
No, but
you know,
this is
there are
getting back to the
mechanisms for
point of the Bangladesh Bank governor is that, again, like I said, it's actually a lot of it has to do with confidence. It has to do with the confidence, as John alluded to, internationally, and also the confidence people have domestically. And I think one of the great advantages we had with Ehsan Manzoor is that we had with people like Fakhruddin Ahmed in the past, is that they inspired confidence both inside and outside the country. So I think that's really the thing. A lot of this is optics. A lot of this is perception. But in this world in which we live, unfortunately, optics and perception really matter. So this is something I think it is going to be the first great challenge of the BNP government, and I'm going to be very interested to see how they respond, because I think we will learn a lot from how they move forward in the weeks and months to come. Okay, on that note, we have actually gone well over our limit. Like I said, this is a conversation we could have for hours on end, but cognizant of our time limits and the attention span of our viewership, let's end it here. John, any final words?
Only that if the situation in the world doesn't deteriorate further, with knocking on wood, I will actually be in Dhaka when we're scheduled to do this again. So maybe we'll actually get to do this in person. So
All
something
right,
to look
okay.
forward
Well,
to.
I'll see if I can secure a studio then. And let's see. In the meantime, I'll put that on my list. And Jyoti, thank you for joining us. It's always a pleasure. Like I said, when it comes to this kind of stuff, me and John are very much laymen. And so it's very interesting to get the perspective of an actual honest to goodness economist.
Thank you.
Okay. And thank you for tuning in. I think 2 weeks from now, we'll be back, and maybe it'll be a special in-studio edition. But either way, it'll be worth your while. So catch you again in 2 weeks, and thank you, everyone.